They say revenge is a dish best served cold. In my case, it was served with a side of bacon and syrup, though not the breakfast kind. I never planned to make history in suburban America. I certainly never imagined I'd end up in a courtroom with two pigs in custom-tailored tuxedos facing down a red-faced man who'd made it his personal mission to destroy my quiet life. But sometimes, when rules become weapons, you have to get creative with your shields. The day I decided to make my mini pigs members of the Homeowners Association was the day my neighbor Brian finally pushed me too far. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Mark Lawson, and 18 months ago I decided city life was slowly killing me. The constant noise, the sardine can apartment, the neighbors who seemed to practice their drumming exclusively between midnight and 4 a.m., I needed out. I'd spent 10 years working in finance, saving everything I could, dreaming of a place where I could hear birds instead of car alarms. When I finally had enough for a down payment, I found what I thought was my sanctuary: Oak Ridge Estates, a quiet, suburban development with neat houses, decent-sized yards, and, crucially, trees. Actual trees. The sales agent kept emphasizing the connection to nature and peaceful community living. What she conveniently forgot to mention was that Oak Ridge had one of the most aggressive homeowners associations in the tri-state area. But I'm not complaining about the HOA, at least not all of it. Just Brian. Brian Davidson lived across the street and 2 houses down from me. He was in his 50s, with the meticulously maintained lawn of someone who has nothing better to do with his time than measure each blade of grass for uniformity. A retired accountant who had found his true calling as the self-appointed neighborhood watchdog, and, unfortunately, vice president of the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. I might have never crossed paths with Brian if it weren't for bacon and syrup. See, I'd always wanted a pet, but my work schedule made owning a dog impractical. Cats didn't appeal to me. Too aloof. Then I read an article about mini pigs as pets. Intelligent, clean, and with the emotional range of a 3-year-old child, mini pigs seemed perfect. After months of research, I found a reputable breeder and brought home 2 adorable piglets. Bacon, ironic, I know, and syrup. I chose the names thinking they were funny, but looking back, maybe I was tempting fate. For the first 3 months at Oak Ridge, everything was perfect. I worked from home as a financial analyst. My little yard became a sanctuary, and the pigs were a constant source of joy. They learned tricks faster than most dogs I knew. They used a litter box. They snuggled on the couch while I watched movies, and they never barked at passing cars or dug up the neighbors' flower beds. Then came the encounter. It was a crisp Saturday morning in September. I was in the backyard, drinking coffee and watching bacon and syrup explore a pile of leaves I'd raked together for them. The gate to my yard creaked open, and there stood Brian, clipboard in hand, measuring tape dangling from his belt like a gunslinger's holster. "Morning," I called, raising my coffee mug in greeting. Brian didn't return the pleasantry. His eyes were fixed on my pigs, who had stopped rooting through the leaves to stare curiously at the intruder. "Are those pigs?" he asked, his face contorting, as if I were harboring radioactive waste. "Mini pigs," I corrected. "Bacon and syrup. Want to meet them? They're friendly." Brian took a step back. "You can't have livestock here. This is a residential neighborhood, not a farm," I laughed. "They're not livestock. They're pets. Cleaner than most dogs, actually." Brian's eyes narrowed. "Pets or not, they're still swine. Have you read the HOA covenant? Section 12.1 clearly states, they're indoors most of the time," I interrupted. "They're litter trained. They don't make noise. No one would even know they're here unless they came into my backyard uninvited." I emphasized that last part, hoping he'd take the hint. He didn't. Instead, he pulled out his phone and began taking pictures. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Documenting the violation. This will be discussed at the next HOA meeting." And with that, he turned and left, leaving my gate swinging open. Bacon trotted over and pushed it closed with his snout, which would have been adorable if I wasn't suddenly filled with dread. 3 days later, a letter arrived from the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. The envelope was cream-colored with the association's oak tree logo embossed in gold. Fancy, like it was announcing a royal ball instead of threatening me with fines. "Dear Mr. Lawson," it began, "it has come to our attention that your property, Lot HOA 24, currently houses animals classified as agricultural livestock, sus scrofa domesticus. According to Covenant Paragraph 12.1 of the Oak Ridge Estates bylaws, no homeowner shall keep or maintain any animals commonly classified as livestock or poultry, including but not limited to cattle, swine, goats, sheep, chickens, ducks, or geese." The letter went on to inform me that I had 14 days to remedy the violation or face an initial fine of $150, followed by $50 per day until the situation was resolved. It was signed by Diane Winters, HOA president, but I knew exactly who was behind it. I immediately called the HOA office and asked to speak with Diane. The receptionist informed me that she was traveling in Europe for 3 weeks. How convenient. Instead, I was transferred to the acting president, Brian Davidson. "Brian," I said when he answered, "we need to talk about this letter. Mark, the rules are very clear. No swine allowed in Oak Ridge Estates. They're pets, not livestock. They're smaller than most dogs. A pig is a pig, Mark. Size doesn't change their classification. They're clean, quiet, and well-behaved. They stay in my yard. How are they bothering anyone?" Brian's voice took on the condescending tone of someone explaining a simple concept to a particularly slow child. "It's not about bothering anyone. It's about maintaining property values and community standards. What's next? Goats? A cow? Where do we draw the line?" I took a deep breath. "These are domesticated mini pigs bred specifically to be pets. They're no different from having a dog or a cat. The covenant disagrees with you. You have 14 days. Click." He hung up. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the letter while Bacon and Syrup napped on their cushioned bed in the corner. The thought of giving them up was unthinkable. They weren't just pets. They were family. The next day I went, door to door in my immediate vicinity, introducing myself to neighbors I hadn't yet met, and explaining the situation. Most seemed completely unbothered by the presence of pigs in the neighborhood. A few were even excited, asking if they could meet Bacon and Syrup sometime. One elderly woman, Mrs. Peterson, told me she'd had pet chickens at her previous home and thought the HOA rules were a bunch of hooey. Armed with this unofficial support, I drafted a petition requesting an exception to the livestock rule for mini pigs classified as pets. Over the next week, I collected 27 signatures from the 42 homes in Oak Ridge Estates. I submitted my petition at the HOA office, feeling confident. The receptionist, a friendly woman named Carol who had already signed my petition, wished me luck. 2 days later, I received another letter. This one was brief. "Dear Mr. Lawson, your petition has been reviewed and rejected by the board. The 14-day compliance period remains in effect. Regards, Brian Davidson, Acting President." That evening, as I watched Bacon and Syrup playing with their favorite ball in the living room, I made a decision. If Brian wanted to play by the rules, we would play by the rules. All of them. The next morning, I called in sick to work and made 2 important appointments. The first was with Dr. Melanie Ramirez, a therapist I'd seen briefly after moving to help with the adjustment. The second was with Alan Goldstein, an attorney specializing in housing law, and, coincidentally, the brother of another Oak Ridge resident who had signed my petition. Dr. Ramirez's office was warm and inviting, with plants in every corner and a small fountain bubbling quietly on a side table. She remembered me and listened intently as I explained my situation. "So these pigs," she said. They help with your anxiety? Absolutely, I replied. Since moving to Oak Ridge, I felt isolated at times. Working from home doesn't help. Bacon and syrup give me a routine, a reason to get up in the morning. They're incredibly intuitive, too. Whenever I'm feeling stressed, they seem to know it and will come sit with me. Dr. Ramirez nodded. Many people don't realize how therapeutic animals can be, beyond just cats and dogs. The emotional support they provide is real. By the end of our session, Dr. Ramirez had agreed to write a letter designating bacon and syrup as emotional support animals for my anxiety disorder. Under the Fair Housing Act, she explained, housing providers must make reasonable accommodations for emotional support animals, regardless of pet policies. Next was Alan Goldstein's office, which was considerably less cozy, all leather and dark wood with degrees and certifications covering one wall. Mini pigs as ESAs, he mused after I explained everything. Creative, but not unprecedented. The FHA has recognized unusual support animals before, but you'll need more than just the therapist's letter to counter the HOA's specific livestock prohibition. He pulled out a copy of the Oak Ridge Estate's bylaws, a thick document I'd signed during closing but, like most people, never actually read. Let's see what we're working with, he said, flipping through pages. For the next hour, Alan and I pored over the bylaws, looking for anything that might help. And then, on page 47, we found it. Section 18.3b. All legal residents of a household, including dependents and those under the care of the homeowner, shall be recognized as members of the community with the right to attend meetings, access common areas, and, if of legal age, vote on community matters. Alan read it twice, then grinned. This is interesting wording. It doesn't specifically say these community members have to be human. Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? I asked. I'm suggesting that your emotional support animals, as dependents under your care, might have a case for community membership. His eyes twinkled. It's a stretch, but it's not explicitly prohibited. That evening I drafted 2 documents. The first was a formal request for reasonable accommodation under the Fair Housing Act, attaching Dr. Ramirez's letter designating bacon and syrup as emotional support animals. The second was an application for community membership for Bacon, Lawson and Syrup Lawson, dependents under the care of Mark Lawson, lot number 24. I hand-delivered both to the HOA office the next morning. Carol raised her eyebrows when she saw the second form but date-stamped it without comment. 2 days passed with no response. The deadline was approaching. I was beginning to worry when my doorbell rang on the 3rd day. It was Brian, and he looked apoplectic. "What kind of game do you think you're playing?" he demanded, before I could even say hello. I feigned innocence. "I'm not playing any game. I'm just following proper procedures for my situation. Emotional support pigs? Community membership applications for animals? This is absurd." "Is it?" I replied calmly. "The Fair Housing Act protects my right to keep emotional support animals regardless of pet policies. And nowhere in the bylaws does it specify that community members must be human." Brian's face turned from red to purple. "This is a mockery of the system." "No, Brian, this is using the system as written. Did you know that 27 of our neighbors signed a petition supporting my pig staying here? The only person who seems to have a problem with them is you. The board's decision was unanimous," he sputtered. "The acting board, you mean? With Diane away, how many people actually voted? 2? 3? Brian straightened his posture. "This isn't over, Mark, not by a long shot." He turned to leave, then paused. "And for the record, I've already filed a complaint with the county animal control about unauthorized livestock." As he marched back to his house, I felt a surge of both anxiety and determination. This had escalated beyond a neighborhood dispute. It was now a matter of principle. Animal control did come the next day, but the visit didn't go as Brian probably hoped. The officer, A friendly woman named Officer Martinez seemed more amused than concerned. "They look well cared for," she said, watching Bacon and Syrup perform tricks for treats. "Clean environment, proper diet, clearly bonded to you. These are pets, not livestock by our definition." She explained that while some municipalities had ordinances against keeping pigs even as pets, our county didn't, as long as they weren't being raised for food and didn't exceed 150 pounds at maturity. Bacon and Syrup at their full growth would barely reach 70 pounds each. "I'll note in my report that these are companion animals with no violations found," Officer Martinez said. "Your neighbor might not be happy, but there's nothing for us to enforce here." As the deadline approached, I received another letter from the HOA. This one was different. It acknowledged receipt of my reasonable accommodation request and stated that the board would need to meet to discuss it, thereby extending the compliance period pending their decision. It also, rather amusingly, acknowledged receipt of my unusual community membership applications, which would be addressed at the next regular HOA meeting. That meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening in the Oak Ridge Community Center. I marked my calendar and began preparing. The next week was a flurry of activity. I consulted further with Alan, who coached me on what to say at the meeting. I ordered 2 custom pet ID badges with clips and the Oak Ridge Estates logo, courtesy of a printing shop that didn't ask questions. I even took Bacon and Syrup for grooming, wanting them to look their best for their debut. Most importantly, I went shopping for what would become the most memorable part of our presentation: 3 matching suits. Thursday evening arrived, and I dressed in my navy blue suit with a red tie. Bacon and Syrup, who were accustomed to wearing harnesses for walks, tolerated their own attire surprisingly well. Custom-tailored doggy tuxedo jackets in the same navy blue with red bow ties. I attached their ID badges to their jackets. Bacon, moral support and deputy for green space; Syrup, friendship coordinator and stress reduction specialist. We arrived at the community center 15 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin. I had Bacon and Syrup on leashes, and they trotted beside me with remarkable dignity in their formal wear. The community center lobby fell silent as we entered. About 20 homeowners were milling about, waiting for the meeting room to open. All eyes turned to us. Mrs. Peterson was the first to react. She clapped her hands together and exclaimed, "Would you look at those dapper gentlemen?" That broke the ice. Soon we were surrounded by curious neighbors, most of whom had heard about the pig situation, but hadn't seen Bacon and Syrup in person. The pigs, always social, soaked up the attention with good manners, accepting gentle pats and offering snout bumps in return. Then the inner door opened, and Brian stepped out to announce the meeting would begin. He froze when he saw us, his mouth hanging open slightly. "What are they doing here?" he finally managed. I smiled pleasantly. "They're here for the meeting, of course. As applicants for community membership, they have the right to attend." "They're pigs. They're emotional support animals and dependents under my care," I corrected. "And they're dressed more formally than half the people here." Someone in the crowd snickered. Brian's jaw tightened. "This is a serious meeting, not a circus." "I agree completely. Shall we begin?" Brian looked like he wanted to argue further, but was aware of the crowd watching with interest. He stepped aside, allowing everyone to file into the meeting room. The room was set up with rows of chairs facing a long table at the front, where Brian and 2 other board members sat. I recognized them vaguely: a woman named Linda who worked in real estate, and a man named Tom who was rarely seen outside of HOA contexts. I took a seat in the front row with Bacon and Syrup sitting politely on the floor beside me. The meeting began with standard HOA fare, budget updates, a discussion about seasonal decorations, approval of last month's minutes. I waited patiently. Finally, Brian cleared his throat. "Now, we have a unique situation to address. Mark Lawson, has submitted a request for reasonable accommodation for emotional support animals, specifically 2 mini pigs. Linda leaned forward. I've reviewed the Fair Housing Act provisions, and it does appear that ESAs are protected regardless of species, as long as they don't pose a threat or create an undue burden. Brian frowned. But our covenant specifically prohibits swine. The FHA supersedes our covenant in this case, Linda replied. We could fight it, but legally I'm not sure we'd win. And it would be expensive. Tom, who had been silent until now, spoke up. I drove by Mark's house several times this week at different hours. Never saw or heard anything disruptive. They're really not visible from the street. Brian looked betrayed. Before he could respond, Linda continued, I move that we approve the reasonable accommodation request with the condition that the animals remain under weight limits specified by county ordinances and are kept primarily indoors or within a fenced yard. Tom quickly seconded the motion. Brian, outnumbered, called for a vote with obvious reluctance. The motion passed 2-1. Now, Brian said, shuffling papers with unnecessary force, we have another matter related to Mr. Lawson. He has submitted community membership applications for these animals, which is clearly a joke and waste of the board's time. I raised my hand. Point of order. The bylaws, Section 18.3b, state that all legal residents of a household, including dependents and those under the care of the homeowner, shall be recognized as members of the community. My pigs are legally residing dependents under my care. Brian pinched the bridge of his nose. The intent of that clause is obviously for human family members. The intent isn't specified anywhere in the document, I countered. The language is inclusive. And now that they're officially recognized as emotional support animals necessary for my health, their status as dependents is even clearer. Linda suppressed what looked suspiciously like a smile. He has a point about the wording. This is ridiculous, Brian snapped. We can't have animals as community members. An older gentleman in the back raised his hand. I'd like to speak. It was Mr. Goldstein, my lawyer's father. I've been part of this community since it was founded. The bylaws were written to be inclusive, yes, but this is clearly stretching the definition beyond reason. Thank you, I thought. A voice of reason. But Mr. Goldstein wasn't finished. That said, he continued, I've met these particular pigs, and they're better behaved than most children I've encountered in the neighborhood. If they're legally allowed to be here as support animals, I don't see the harm in humoring their community membership. Might even liven up these dreadfully boring meetings. Several people laughed. Brian looked like he might spontaneously combust. We're not voting on this nonsense, he declared. Linda cleared her throat. Actually, since it's been formally submitted, we should put it to a vote. The worst that happens is it gets denied. Brian glared at her but proceeded with the vote. To everyone's surprise, possibly even Linda's, both she and Tom voted to approve the membership applications. Are you serious? Brian exploded. The bylaws don't specify humans only, Linda shrugged. And frankly, this entire situation has been blown out of proportion. If Mark wants his pigs to be community members, let them be community members. It hurts no one. And just like that, Bacon and Syrup became the first non-human members of the Oak Ridge Estates community. The meeting continued with other business, but there was a lightness in the room that hadn't been there before. When it came time for open comments, I raised my hand again. I'd like to thank the board for their fair consideration of my requests, I said. And since Bacon and Syrup are now officially community members, I'd like to volunteer their services. Bacon has a knack for identifying invasive plants. He can literally root them out. I paused for the expected groans. And Syrup is exceptionally good with children. They would both be happy to participate in the community garden project or the upcoming fall festival. Brian looked ready to object, but Linda jumped in. That's very generous. Let's discuss possibilities after the meeting. As the meeting adjourned, several neighbors came up to congratulate me and meet the newest official residents. Even Tom from the board came over to scratch Bacon behind the ears, confessing that he'd had a pet pot-bellied pig as a child. Brian, however, stormed out without speaking to anyone. I thought that might be the end of it. I was wrong. The next morning, a local news van was parked outside my house. A reporter, microphone in hand, was waiting at my door when I stepped out to get the mail. "Mr. Lawson? Janet Chen from Channel 12 News. We'd love to talk to you about your pigs making history as the first animal members of a homeowners association." I blinked in surprise. "How did you hear about that?" "We received an anonymous tip," she said with a professional smile. "Very detailed, including copies of the meeting minutes and your application forms. Someone wanted this story told." My first thought was that Brian had contacted them, hoping to publicly shame me. But that didn't make sense. The story made him look bad, not me. I invited Janet in to meet Bacon and Syrup, who were, as always, charming ambassadors. I explained the situation, showing her the original HOA letter, Dr. Ramirez's ESA designation, and the final approval documents. "So this all started because one board member had an issue with your pets?" Janet asked. "Essentially, yes. Though, in fairness, the covenant does prohibit livestock. My position is simply that mini pigs bred as companions aren't livestock." The story aired that evening, featuring footage of Bacon and Syrup in their tuxedos, which I put back on them for the interview, and performing tricks. The tone was lighthearted, portraying them as adorable pets caught in bureaucratic crossfire. They mentioned Brian only briefly as a board member who initially opposed the pigs' residence. What I didn't expect was how quickly the story would spread. By the weekend, it had been picked up by national outlets. "Pigs in Suits Join Homeowners Association," read one headline. "HOA has new members. They're swine, but not the usual kind," quipped another. Social media exploded with photos of Bacon and Syrup in their formal wear, turning them into minor celebrities. The Oak Ridge Estates HOA office received dozens of calls from media outlets seeking comments. Carol, the receptionist, told me later that she'd been instructed to say only that Oak Ridge Estates values diversity and inclusion in all forms. Then came the lawsuit. 2 weeks after the news story broke, I was served with papers. Brian was suing both me and the HOA board, claiming that the approval of my pigs as community members was a violation of the covenant and his rights as a homeowner. He demanded that the decision be reversed and that I pay damages for emotional distress and diminishment of community standing. Alan Goldstein took my case pro bono, amused by the absurdity of it all. "This is the kind of case that makes a career," he told me. Pig rights, the final frontier. The case of Davidson versus Lawson et al. Was heard by Judge Eleanor Martinez, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for strict adherence to the letter of the law. Brian's attorney argued that the intent of the bylaws was clearly to include only humans as community members, and that my pig's membership made a mockery of the association. He presented evidence of declining property values in neighborhoods where livestock was permitted, and argued that my stunt had brought unwanted attention and ridicule to Oak Ridge Estates. Allen countered with the actual text of the bylaws, which never specified human membership. He presented the Fair Housing Act protections for emotional support animals and argued that as legally residing dependents under my care, Bacon and Syrup met all the criteria for community membership as written. "Your Honor," Allen said in his closing argument, "this case ultimately comes down to a simple question. Do the words we write mean what they say, or only what we later claim we meant them to say?" The bylaws, as written and approved by all homeowners including Mr. Davidson, contain no species requirement for community membership. If Mr. Davidson wanted to exclude non-humans, he had ample opportunity to specify that during the drafting process. After 3 days of surprisingly detailed testimony, including an appearance by Bacon and Syrup, who sat quietly in pet carriers at the back of the courtroom, Judge Martinez issued her ruling. Having reviewed the bylaws of Oak Ridge Estates in their entirety, she said, I find no language that explicitly requires community members to be human. While I acknowledge that this was likely the intent, I must rule based on the document as written, not as implied. Furthermore, as these animals have been legally designated as emotional support animals under the Fair Housing Act, their residence in the community is protected regardless of pet policies. She looked directly at Brian. Mr. Davidson, if you wish to amend the bylaws to specify human-only membership for future cases, there are proper channels for that. But you cannot retroactively apply an unwritten rule. Case dismissed. As we left the courthouse, a small crowd of supporters had gathered, many from Oak Ridge Estates. They cheered when we emerged, and someone had even made signs with bacon and syrup's faces on them. Brian pushed through the crowd without looking at anyone. I felt a momentary pang of sympathy for him. He'd been publicly humiliated, and that's never easy. But then I remembered his smug face when he'd told me I had 14 days to get rid of my pets, and the sympathy faded. The aftermath was both surprising and heartwarming. The HOA called a special meeting to revise the bylaws, not to exclude animals, but to create a new category: community mascots. Bacon and Syrup were officially designated as the first Oak Ridge Estates mascots, with all the privileges of community membership accepting voting rights. Linda, who had voted in favor of my pigs from the beginning, revealed during this meeting that she had been the one to tip off the media. I've been on this board for 3 years, she confessed, and I've watched Brian use the rules to bully people over the pettiest things. The garden gnome incident last year nearly drove the Johnsons to move. I thought it was time someone used the rules against him for a change. Brian resigned from the board the following week. Rumor had it he was house hunting in a pig-free community. Diane Winters, returning from her European trip to find her HOA had become nationally famous for its pig members, took the whole thing in stride. At least we're known for something positive, she said at her first meeting back. The neighborhood, too, miles over, is still trying to live down that scandal with the embezzling treasurer. As for Bacon and Syrup, they continued their lives largely as before, though now with community responsibilities. They made regular appearances at neighborhood events, always in their tuxedos. The fall festival featured a popular photo booth with them. The community garden thrived under Bacon's enthusiastic root vegetable inspection service. And me? I found myself with more friends in the neighborhood than I'd ever expected. People would stop by just to say hello or bring treats for the pigs. Mrs. Peterson started a neighborhood book club that met in my backyard, with Bacon and Syrup as unofficial hosts. 1 year after the lawsuit, I received a letter from the HOA. For a moment my heart raced with old anxiety, but inside was a simple certificate. In recognition of outstanding contribution to community spirit and innovative interpretation of bylaws, Oak Ridge Estates hereby names the annual neighborhood picnic the Bacon and Syrup Solidarity Feast. It was signed by every board member, including the new vice president, me. Sometimes at night, when Bacon and Syrup are snoozing on their cushions and the neighborhood is quiet, I think about how differently things could have gone. If I'd given in to Brian's demands, if I hadn't found that loophole in the bylaws, if Linda and Tom hadn't voted with me. But mostly, I think about how one person's petty power trip led to a community becoming stronger, friendlier, and yes, more inclusive, even of species not originally intended. And if that isn't democracy in action, I don't know what is.